I want you to picture the exact moment I stopped recognizing the man I had been married to for 27 years. It was a Thursday, a little after 7, and I was standing near the front of a steakhouse on West Paces Ferry, holding a to-go bag with a birthday cake inside, because it was our anniversary that weekend, and I wanted to surprise him. I had left my car with the valet. I had put on the earrings he gave me the year our daughter was born, and then I looked across the dining room and saw my husband, Michael, leaning toward a woman who was not me, brushing a strand of hair off her face with the back of his fingers, the way you only touch someone you have already decided you belong to. She was young. Not scandalously young, but young enough that I understood the whole thing in about 2 seconds without anyone saying a word to me. I knew her, actually. Her name was Danielle, and she worked in his firm's Atlanta office, and I had shaken her hand once at a Christmas party and told her she had a lovely laugh. She was laughing now, at something my husband said, with her hand resting on the table an inch from his, comfortable, like it had been there before. My name is Laura Bennett. I was 54 years old, and I stood there in the entrance of that restaurant holding a cake I had picked out that afternoon, and the strangest thing happened. I did not cry. I did not walk over. I turned to the hostess who was waiting to seat me, and I heard myself say, very calmly, that I had changed my mind, and I walked back out into the warm Georgia evening and handed my ticket to the valet, and waited for my car with my hands perfectly steady. I want to tell you why they were steady. Because that is the part of this story that matters, and it is the part almost nobody expects. I had spent 27 years being the quiet one, the supportive one, the woman who gave up her own career so his could grow, who raised our daughter mostly alone during the years he was building the practice, who hosted the dinners and remembered the birthdays of his partner's wives and made herself small so that he could feel large. And for a long, long time I believed that was love, and maybe part of it was. But standing in that parking lot, watching a valet bring around the car that was technically in his name, in front of the house that was technically in his name, funded by the money that everyone assumed was technically his, I understood that Michael thought he could end this whenever he wanted, on his terms, and leave me with nothing. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. If you've ever given the best years of your life to someone and then watched them treat you like you were disposable, then stay with me, because this story is for you, and I think you're going to want to see how it ends. If stories about real people, real betrayal, and the moment someone finally stops being invisible mean something to you, go ahead and like this video and subscribe, because I promise you, the way this turned out is not the way anyone at that steakhouse would have guessed. Here is what Michael did not know. Sitting there brushing that woman's hair back like I was already a thing of the past. 27 years earlier, before the wedding, before the practice, before the house on the hill and the cars and the country club, his father had insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Michael's family had money then, and mine had none, and that document was written to protect him from me. Everyone signed it. Everyone forgot about it. It went into a drawer and stayed there for a quarter of a century. I never forgot about it. And there was one clause in that prenup, one paragraph that Michael's father's lawyers had added almost as an afterthought, that was about to turn this entire divorce upside down. I drove home that night the long way, through the neighborhoods where the houses get smaller the farther you go from the club, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I talked to myself out loud in the car, not crying, not yelling, just working it through, the way you do when your mind is trying to catch up with something your body already understood. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the cake was still on the passenger seat in its white box, and I remember sitting there in the dark with the engine ticking, deciding what kind of woman I was going to be for the next few weeks. Because I already knew I wasn't going to say anything. Not yet. Michael got home around 10. I heard the garage, heard his keys hit the bowl by the door, heard him call out that he'd grabbed dinner with a client and hoped I'd eaten. I was on the couch with a book I wasn't reading, and I told him yes, I'd eaten, and asked how the client was. He said fine. He said the man was thinking about moving his whole portfolio over. He kissed the top of my head on his way to the stairs, the way he'd done 10,000 times, and I smelled her perfume on his collar, and I smiled and said goodnight and turned another page I didn't read. I want you to understand that I'm not proud of how good I was at that. 27 years of making myself agreeable had turned pretending into something close to a reflex. But that night, it stopped being weakness and started being strategy, and there is a difference, even if it looks the same from the outside. To understand why I could sit on that couch so calmly, you have to go back to the beginning, to a version of me that most people who know us now would not even recognize. I was 26 when I met Michael Bennett. I had a job I loved at a marketing firm downtown, a little apartment in Virginia Highland with a fire escape I used as a balcony, and a plan. I was good at what I did. My boss had started giving me my own accounts, and there was talk, real talk, about making me the youngest account director they'd ever had. I mention this because I want you to know that I was a whole person before I became somebody's wife. I had my own weather. I generated my own light. Michael was in law school then, sharp and funny, and so certain of where he was going that being near him felt like standing next to a fire on a cold night. His family had money, the kind that's quiet and old, and mine had none, the kind that counts change at the grocery store. When he proposed, 8 months in, his father took me to lunch alone. I thought it was to welcome me. It wasn't, exactly. Over salads at a place with cloth napkins, Robert Bennett explained to me, kindly and completely without malice, that there would need to be an agreement, a prenuptial agreement, to protect the family's assets. He said he was sure I understood, that it was nothing personal, that it was simply what people in their position did. I was 26 and in love, and I said, of course I understood, and I signed everything they put in front of me a few weeks later without reading it closely, because reading it closely felt like an accusation I couldn't afford to make. I didn't know then that I was signing the most important document of my life. I didn't know that the man across that lunch table would, in his careful, lawyerly way, add something to that agreement that his own son would never bother to read, and that a quarter of a century later, it would be the only thing standing between me and starting over at 54 with nothing. The first thing to go was the job. It wasn't a fight. It was never a fight. That was the thing about Michael. He never made you give something up. He just made keeping it feel selfish. His hours got longer as he moved up at the firm. There were dinners we had to attend, weekends we had to travel, a whole social world I had to learn to navigate for the sake of his career. And somewhere in there, my own account started slipping. The late nights I couldn't work turned into the promotion I didn't get. And one day my boss sat me down and said, gently, that maybe my heart wasn't in it anymore. He wasn't wrong. My heart was busy holding up a life that had my husband's name on it. I handed in my notice on a Friday. Michael sent flowers to the house that afternoon with a card that said, "Thank you for believing in us." I cried when I read it, and at the time I thought they were happy tears. Then our daughter Emily came, and for a while I didn't have room to miss the person I used to be. Michael was making partner by then, gone before she woke up and home after she slept, and I raised her in that big quiet house mostly by myself. I don't say that with bitterness, not about Emily. She was the best thing either of us ever did. But I raised her alone, and I ran the house alone, and I remembered every partner's wife's birthday, and hosted every dinner and made myself smaller and smaller so that Michael could keep getting larger. And I told myself the whole time that this was the deal. This was love. This was what a good wife does. And it was the deal. That was exactly the problem. There was a deal, in writing, in a drawer upstairs, and I was the only one of us who remembered it was there. He told me on a Sunday, which I've thought about a lot since, because Sunday was the day we used to protect. No work, no phones at the table, just us and the paper and coffee on the back porch. That was our tradition, one of the few things that had survived. So when he came out onto the porch that morning already dressed, in real clothes instead of the old sweatpants, I knew before he sat down that the porch wasn't going to survive either. He didn't reach for my hand. That's how I knew he'd rehearsed it. Michael was a toucher when he wanted something and a folder of hands when he'd already decided. He told me he'd been unhappy for a long time. He told me we'd grown into different people, that we wanted different things now, that he had a lot of respect for me and for everything I'd done for this family. He actually used that phrase, "everything you've done for this family," like he was reading me a performance review before letting me go. And then he said the word divorce, plain and quiet, like setting down a glass, and he watched my face to see how bad it was going to be. I didn't give him the show he was braced for. I asked him if there was someone else. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I watched him decide that lying wasn't worth the effort, and he said yes. He said her name like I'd never heard it. Danielle. He said it wasn't the reason, that the marriage had been over long before her, which is the thing every man in his position says because he needs it to be true, so he can look at himself. I let him have it. I nodded. I said I understood, and I watched the relief move across his face, the relief of a man who'd expected a storm and gotten a calm sea, and I understood something about him in that moment that I'd somehow missed in 27 years. He thought my calm meant surrender. He thought a woman who didn't fight was a woman who couldn't. He started talking logistics almost immediately. That was the part that told me how long he'd really been planning. The house, he said, would obviously stay with him, since it was in his name and always had been. He'd be generous, though. He wanted me to know that. He'd help me find a nice apartment, something comfortable. And of course, there'd be some support for a transition period while I got back on my feet. Got back on my feet. At 54. After I'd given him both of mine to stand on, I want to take you back now to the years that built the very thing he was so calmly offering to keep. Because the house on the hill, the practice, the whole comfortable life he thought was his to divide up like a pie, none of it appeared on its own. When Michael left the big firm to start his own practice, Emily was 9. It was the most frightening year of our marriage. He was walking away from a partner's salary to gamble on himself, and for 18 months there was almost no money coming in and a great deal going out. I was the one who held the line at home. I cut everything. I did the books for the new practice at the kitchen table at night after Emily was asleep, unpaid, because we couldn't afford a bookkeeper, and I learned QuickBooks from a library video and taught myself which invoices to chase and which vendors would wait. I answered his office phone from our house those first months and told clients he was in a meeting when he was actually driving Emily to school so I could work. I planned the dinners that landed his first big clients, sat across from their wives, and made them feel like the most interesting women in Atlanta, because Michael had told me those relationships mattered, and he was right. They did. There's one night I go back to more than the others. It was maybe a year into the practice, and a major client, a developer who could have made or broken us, came to dinner at our house with his wife. That afternoon, Emily spiked a fever of 103. I had a sick child upstairs and a career-defining dinner downstairs, and a husband who looked at me across the kitchen, completely helpless, and said, "I don't know what to do here." So I did what I always did. I ran both. I got Emily settled with cool cloths and a movie, and checked on her between courses, slipping upstairs in my good dress with a thermometer in my hand. And downstairs I was charming and warm, and the wife of a man who had it all together. That developer signed with Michael's firm the next week. He mentioned, years later, that his wife had never forgotten how lovely that evening was. Nobody remembered the little girl burning up in the room over their heads, or the woman running up and down those stairs in heels holding both halves of a life together. Nobody but me. That's the thing about the kind of work I did for 27 years. It doesn't show up anywhere. It's not on a deed or a bank statement or a partnership agreement. There's no line item for the wife who taught herself accounting at midnight, who nursed the client relationships and the feverish child in the same evening, who built the soft foundation the whole hard structure stood on. It's invisible. And a man like Michael can look at the house that invisible work paid for and genuinely believe, in his heart, that it's his. He believed it right up until the moment his own father's words, written before either of them knew what our life would become, said otherwise. The weeks after that Sunday taught me exactly how little Michael thought of me, and I mean that almost gratefully, because clarity is a kind of gift even when it comes wrapped in insult. He moved fast. Within days there were papers, drawn up by a lawyer at his own firm, a man who'd eaten at my table and complimented my cooking. The papers laid it all out in clean language, the house to Michael, the accounts to Michael, the practice, of course, to Michael. And for me, a support figure so modest it would have embarrassed the developer whose deal I once saved from a sickbed. Attached to it, almost as a courtesy, was a copy of the prenuptial agreement I'd signed at 26, the one that made all of it, on paper, airtight. He'd had someone pull it from the files. He wanted me to see it. He wanted me to understand there was no point in fighting. And then he asked me to leave. Not in anger, which would almost have been easier. He asked the way you'd ask a houseguest whose visit had run long. He said it would be simpler for everyone if I found a place soon, that Danielle would be. And here he paused, spending more time here, and it would be awkward. He said I could take my personal things, my clothes, my books, whatever was clearly mine, as if 27 years in a house left anything that was clearly just mine, as if I could pack up an invisible life into cardboard boxes and carry it out the door. I started seeing her around after that. Danielle. She began appearing at things, at a firm event I still attended because I hadn't yet learned I was uninvited from my own life, at a restaurant near the house, once in the passenger seat of Michael's car in our own driveway, waiting while he ran in for something, looking at the house with the frank, appraising eyes of a woman measuring a room she's about to redecorate. She wasn't cruel to me. That would have required her to see me as a rival, and she didn't. She saw me as a previous owner, something to be politely thanked and then removed. I want to tell you about the lowest night, because I think a lot of you have had one like it, and I don't want to pretend I skipped straight from betrayal to strength like it's a light switch. It isn't. One night, alone in that house, I found myself standing in the closet we'd shared, running my hand along his suits, and I realized I could not remember the last time anyone had asked me a single question about myself. Not what I thought, not what I wanted, not how my day had been. I had spent so many years being the person who asked, the person who listened, the person who arranged, that I had slowly disappeared, and the terrifying thing was that I'd done it to myself, one small yes at a time. I sat down on the floor of that closet and I cried the way you cry when there's no one in the house to hear you. And I want to be honest, some of that crying was grief for the marriage, but most of it was grief for the girl on the fire escape in Virginia Highland, the one with her own accounts and her own weather, who I'd let get so quiet I could barely hear her anymore. But here is what happened when I finished crying. I got up, and instead of going to bed, I went to the study, and I opened the bottom drawer of the old filing cabinet, the one Michael never touched because he thought it held nothing but Emily's old report cards and expired warranties, and I took out a folder I had put there myself 27 years earlier. My own copy of the prenup. Not the one his lawyer had pulled and photocopied and waved at me. Mine. The original I'd been given the day I signed. The one I had actually, finally, sitting on my apartment floor the night after that lunch with his father. Read all the way through. Because that's the part nobody knew. At 26, I had signed it without reading it in front of them, to save face, to seem gracious. But I took it home. And that night, alone, I read every line, because my own mother, who cleaned houses for a living and had nothing, had told me one thing before I married up. Never sign your name to a thing you haven't read to the last word. So I read it. All of it. And I found, near the very end, a clause that Robert Bennett's lawyers had added, and I remember reading it twice at 26 and thinking, and filing it away, and not needing it, and half forgetting it, for 27 years. I sat in that study at 2 a.m. with the folder open on my lap, and I read the clause again for the first time in decades, and my hands, which had been steady in the restaurant, which had been steady on that porch, finally started to shake. Not from fear, from something closer to the feeling you get when you've been holding your breath so long you forgot you were doing it, and you finally let it out. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 27 years. I made an appointment for myself, in my own name, that had nothing to do with Michael's schedule or Michael's needs. I called the best divorce attorney in Atlanta, a woman named Patricia Vance, who I'd heard other wives whisper about in the way you whisper about someone dangerous, and I asked for the earliest morning she had, and I brought the folder. Patricia Vance's office was on a high floor with a view of the whole city, and she was nothing like I expected. I'd pictured someone sharp and cold. Instead, she was a woman about my age, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair she'd clearly stopped apologizing for years ago, and she made me a cup of tea and let me talk for a long time before she said a single word about the law. When I finally slid the folder across her desk, she put on the glasses, and she read, and I watched her face the way you watch a doctor reading a scan. She got to the last page. She read it again. Then she took the glasses off, set them down, looked at me over the top of them, and said quietly, "Mrs. Bennett, does your husband know this is in here?" I told her I didn't think he'd read it in his life. She almost smiled. Here is what that clause said, the one Robert Bennett's lawyers had added at the very end all those years ago. The whole agreement was built to protect Michael, to keep the family's assets separate, to make sure that if the marriage ended, what was his stayed his. But Robert was a particular kind of man, old-fashioned in a way that cut both directions. He had watched his own brother blow a family apart with an affair and a messy exit, and it had marked him. So into an agreement designed to protect his son from a wife, he'd quietly written a condition meant to protect the marriage from his son. The clause stated that the separate property protections would hold only so long as both parties upheld the fidelity of the marriage. If either spouse was found to have committed adultery, and that adultery was a cause of the divorce, then that spouse forfeited the protections of the agreement entirely. The estate would then be divided not by the prenup, but by ordinary equitable division under Georgia law, as if the prenup had never existed, with spousal support determined the same way. Robert had put it there to keep his son honest. He'd assumed, I think, that the only person who'd ever be tempted to stray was some future gold digger, and he wanted a lever against her too. He never imagined the person it would catch would be Michael. And Michael, who inherited his father's money and his father's house but not his father's care, had never read to the end of the document that made him feel so safe. He'd been so sure the prenup was a wall around everything he had that it never occurred to him it might have a door in it, and that he might be the one to walk through it. Patricia laid it out for me plainly, so I wouldn't get my hopes ahead of the facts. She said the clause was strong but not automatic. We would need to establish the affair as a cause of the divorce, clearly and cleanly, on the record. She said the good news was that men like Michael, men who feel protected, get careless. They don't hide things well because they don't believe they'll ever have to. She asked me if I had anything, and I thought about the perfume on his collar, and the name he said like I'd never heard it, and the woman in my driveway measuring the house with her eyes, and I realized that in his total confidence that I was already gone, Michael had never once bothered to cover his tracks. Everything was there. The messages. The trips billed as client meetings. The apartment he was already paying for on the side. He'd left it all in the open because you only hide things from people you respect enough to fear. We didn't rush. That was the hardest part for me, the waiting. Because now that I could see the shape of what was possible, everything in me wanted to march home and throw that folder on the porch table and watch his face fall. But Patricia taught me something in those weeks that I've carried ever since. She said, "The woman who wins is not the one who explodes first. She's the one who prepares, while everyone assumes she's collapsing." So I let them assume. I let Michael think I was out looking at sad little apartments. I let Danielle keep measuring the rooms. I even let him be generous and patronizing about the timeline, nodding along, playing the broken wife, while Patricia and I quietly built something clean and complete and impossible to argue with. There were nights in that stretch when I almost pitied him. I'd catch him whistling in the kitchen, so light, so free. A man who thought he'd gotten away clean, and some old loyalty in me would ache. 27 years is 27 years. I had loved him. I'd carried his child up and down a flight of stairs in a good dress. But then I'd remember the way he'd asked me to leave my own home, the small support figure, the phrase, "Everything you've done for this family," said like a severance package, and the ache would harden back into resolve. I wasn't doing this out of hatred. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. I was doing it because for 27 years I had let my worth be invisible, and I had finally found the one place it was written down in black and white, in his own father's hand, and I was not going to let it stay invisible for one more day. Patricia filed on our terms, not his, and she made sure of one thing above all. She made sure that when the two sides finally sat down across a conference table, Michael's lawyer, the one who'd eaten at my table, would be the one to discover what was waiting at the end of that document. Not from us. From his own client's father, reaching forward across 27 years to settle a debt his son didn't even know he owed. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning, in a conference room on a floor even higher than Patricia's, with the same wide view of a city where I had spent 27 years being someone's wife. Michael came in like a man arriving to sign for a package. He wore the confident half-smile I'd watched him use on opposing counsel for decades, and he barely looked at me, because in his mind I was already handled, already gone, a formality between him and the rest of his life. His lawyer, David, the one who'd praised my cooking, gave me a small, uncomfortable nod. Danielle wasn't there. I was almost sorry. I'd have liked her to see it. We sat. There was coffee no one drank. Michael's side opened the way they'd planned, walking through their offer with the easy rhythm of men who expect to be agreed with. The house to Michael, the accounts to Michael, the practice to Michael. A modest, time-limited support for me. Generous. David actually used that word. Given the protections of the prenuptial agreement, a copy of which he slid across the table like a closing argument that had already won. Michael leaned back. He looked, for the first time all morning, directly at me, and I understood the look. It was pity. He pitied me. Patricia let the silence sit for a moment. Then she opened her own folder and she said, in a voice so pleasant it made the hair on my arms stand up, that we agreed the prenuptial agreement should absolutely govern this divorce. Every word of it. She said we were, in fact, insisting on it, and she slid a single page across the table. The last page, my page, the one I'd read on my apartment floor at 26, and she asked David if he would be so kind as to read the highlighted clause aloud, for his client's benefit. I watched David's eyes move down the page. I watched the exact second they stopped. He read it once to himself, and his face did something complicated. And he read it again. And then he did the thing a good lawyer is never supposed to do in front of the other side. He went still. He looked up. Not at Patricia, not at me, but at Michael. And he didn't say a word. And that silence was louder than anything anyone could have shouted. Michael's smile held for a moment out of pure habit, the way a building stands for a second after the ground has already given way. "Read it," he said. "What is it?" And David, quietly, read it out loud. The clause about fidelity. The forfeiture of all protections in the event of adultery that caused the divorce. The estate to be divided as if the prenuptial agreement had never existed. I watched my husband of 27 years hear his own father's voice come across a quarter of a century to tell him no. He said it wasn't valid. He said his father would never. And Patricia said gently that his father had, in his own attorney's hand, witnessed and signed, and that she had already confirmed its enforceability, and that we had ample documentation that the affair predated and precipitated the divorce. She laid it out then, not cruelly, just completely. The apartment he'd been paying for, the trips billed as client meetings, the messages he'd never bothered to hide because he'd never believed anyone would look. Each piece she set down was another inch of ground disappearing under him, and I sat there and watched the man who had asked me to pack my life into boxes realize that the wall he'd hidden behind had been mine all along. He turned to me, and this was the moment I'd wondered about. The one I'd played out 100 ways in that big, quiet house. I thought I might feel triumphant. I thought I might finally say all the things, but what I felt, looking at him, was something quieter and much bigger. He asked me, in a voice I hadn't heard from him in years, one that was almost pleading, how long I had known, and I told him the truth. I told him 27 years. I told him I read it the night after his father took me to lunch and made me feel like something to be guarded against. I told him I'd carried the one thing that could undo him in a drawer the whole time we were happy, and I never once thought about using it, because I'd loved him, and a person who's loved doesn't go looking for the exit. I only went looking, I said, after he showed me the door. The number, when it was all divided as if the prenup had never existed, was not close to what he'd offered me. It was half of everything. Half the accounts. Half the value of the practice I'd kept alive at a kitchen table. And the house on the hill that I had run alone and filled and held together through a feverish child and a career-defining dinner and 27 years of invisible work. That house was sold, and my half of it was more than enough to build something that was, for the first time in my adult life, only mine. Michael didn't whistle in the kitchen anymore after that. I heard later that things with Danielle didn't last the year, which surprised no one, least of all me. A relationship that begins by measuring someone else's rooms rarely learns to build its own, but I've found I don't spend much time thinking about either of them. That's the strangest gift in all of it. I walked into that conference room to win a divorce, and I walked out having won something I'd lost so slowly I hadn't even noticed it was gone. Myself. The woman on the fire escape. She'd been in that drawer the whole time too, folded up next to the agreement, waiting for me to finally read all the way to the end. These days I have a small house on the other side of the city, nothing like the one on the hill, and I love it in a way I never managed to love that big, quiet place I spent so many years holding together. It has a porch, a little one, barely big enough for 2 chairs, and it faces east. So the morning comes in slow and gold. On Sundays, I still make coffee. I thought I might have to give Sundays up, the way you give up a song after a breakup, but I found I didn't want to let him have them. So I kept the day and let go of the man. I make the coffee the way I like it now, which I'm a little embarrassed to admit I had to relearn, because for 27 years I made it the way he liked it, and somewhere along the way, I forgot I'd ever had a preference of my own. I take it out to that little porch and I sit down, and I drink it while it's hot, all the way to the bottom of the cup. I think about that a lot actually, drinking it while it's hot. There was a version of my life where I was always setting the cup down to do something for somebody else, coming back to it cold, pouring it out, starting over. A whole marriage of coffee gone cold on the counter while I answered a phone that wasn't mine to answer, ran upstairs in a good dress, made myself small so someone else could feel large. Nobody's calling me away from the cup now. It's the smallest thing. It's everything. Emily comes by on some of those Sundays. She's grown now, with a life of her own, and she watched all of it, more than I wanted her to. Not long ago, she asked me if I regretted the years, and I told her the truth, that I don't. Because those years gave me her, and I'd sign that deal again 1,000 times. But I told her the other truth too, The one my own mother gave me before I ever married up. The one I'd forgotten and then remembered at 2 a.m. in a study with a folder open on my lap. Never sign your name to a thing you haven't read to the last word. She's 29. I hope she takes longer to understand it than I did. People ask me sometimes if I hate him, Michael. I don't, and that surprises them. Hating him would mean he still gets to live in my house, and I've done enough of letting him live rent-free in rooms that were supposed to be mine. What I feel, when I feel anything, is a kind of distant gratitude, because in trying to leave me with nothing, he accidentally handed me back the one thing I'd been missing the whole time. Not the house, not the money, though the money helped. He handed me back the woman on the fire escape, the one with her own accounts and her own weather, who I'd let get so quiet I almost couldn't hear her. She's not quiet anymore. So if you're out there and you're in the middle of your own cold cup, if someone has looked at everything you built and decided you were disposable, I want you to know something. Being left is not the same as being finished. Sometimes the door somebody slams behind you is the first one that ever opened onto a life that's actually yours. The morning I signed the final papers, I came home to this little house, and I made a fresh pot, and I sat on that porch, and there was something I noticed for the first time in longer than I can say. How good it feels to be the only person a woman is taking care of. But that's a story for another cup.